Peter Kornblum, director of the National Security Archives Chile Documentation Project, led a campaign to declassify documents regarding the U.S. government's relationship with the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. Next on Book TV, he details his findings. It's an hour and 15 minutes.
Last Thursday was the 30th anniversary of the 1973 coup in Chile, and we're very honored to have Mr. Peter Kornblum here. His new book is called The Pinochet File. Peter Kornblum is director of the National Security Archive, a library of declassified U.S. government material based in George Washington University. And he's written several books based on documents that have been released by the U.S. government on Iran-Contra, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is a very important book. It's a very interesting book. It leads one to the impression that, well, it's a very controversial book as well, but one of the things that has always been argued by those conservatives in Chile was that the coup was something that happened from the inside. But what this book clearly shows is that there was an awful lot of stuff going on from the outside. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Mr. Peter Kornblum.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces, people I worked with for many, many years. You know, and I know, and I think you know, that a large community has been built around the issue of Chile. Many people, including some who are here today, came directly from Chile after the coup and started organizations here in Washington to work towards human rights and the restoration of democracy there, that in some ways changed the history of our country, certainly changed our laws, and I think had a great impact on people like myself. And it was always a great satisfaction for me knowing that in writing this book, I might make a small contribution to the work of that community and take my place in it. I want to start with a declassified document, but of course, a declassified document. This is a book built around declassified documents. Let me just tell you what it is. This is a memorandum that Henry Kissinger's deputy at the National Security Council, a man named Viren Vakey, wrote to him on September 14th, 1970. September 14th was 11 days after socialist leader Salvador Allende was elected democratically to the presidency of Chile. He hadn't been inaugurated yet and wasn't due to be inaugurated for another 6 weeks, but he had been elected 11 days earlier. And already the White House was considering what kind of covert actions might be implemented to keep him from actually assuming the presidency. And this is what Kissinger's deputy wrote to him, opposing U.S. covert operations to thwart Allende from becoming president. What we propose, Vakey wrote, is patently a violation of our own principles and policy tenets. This is a secret, sensitive memo, by the way. Moralism aside, this has practical operational consequences. If these principles have any meaning, we normally depart from them only to meet the gravest threat to us. Example given to our survival. Is Allende a mortal threat to the United States? Vakey posed this question to Kissinger, and he answered it. It is hard to argue this. These words, I think, resonate today as we discuss whether in today's world we face mortal threats abroad and what the appropriate U.S. response should be. Chile also resonates as an example, an original example, a rather classic example of a preemptive strike. Think about it. The day after this memo was written, Kissinger, ignoring this advice, went to a 15-minute meeting in the Oval Office with Richard Nixon on September 15th. CIA Director Richard Helms was there, and we have Richard Helms's handwritten notes from this meeting, the orders of the President of the United States. This is a rather famous document. I don't know how many of you have seen this document before? Very, very few of you. Only a small handful. This document has actually been around for almost 27 years. It was declassified during the Special Senate investigation into Chile in 1975. But this is an important document. This is the only extant document, the only declassified document we have of the President of the United States of America ordering the overthrow of a democratically elected government. Certainly we have declassified documents going way back of presidents ordering the overthrow of other regimes, not elected ones that came to power through armed force, such as Fidel Castro's, etc. But this is the only one we have of a president ordering the rollback of a decision by another country to democratically elect their leader. And this document reads, 1 in 10 chance, perhaps, but save Chile, worth spending, $10 million, available, more if necessary, no involvement of the embassy. Don't tell the ambassador. This is a full-time job, best men we have. Give me a game plan. And then the most famous line, make the economy scream. I'm going to pass this document around just because I want people to be able to see it for themselves. This was Richard Nixon saying to the CIA, I want you to foment chaos in Chile, make the economy scream, do what is necessary to create a situation whereby the military moves to block Allende from actually being inaugurated president of Chile. Now think about it. Preemptive strike. This document is dated September 15th, 1970. Allende is not due to be inaugurated for another 6 weeks until November 3rd, 1970. He has not yet assumed the presidency. He has yet to implement, as president of Chile, a single policy detrimental to U.S. interests. And yet, Nixon had decided, as CIA Director Helms told his staff the next day, that Allende was, and I quote, unacceptable to the United States, and had ordered the CIA to foment this coup. The country of Chile. The Chilean poet Pablo Neruda once described his country as a long petal of sea wine and snow. How many of you have ever been there? Well, a good many of you. And you know that this is a beautiful, beautiful country. It starts with an extremely dry desert in the north, and it ends with glaciers in the south. And in between there are lots and lots of vineyards and grapes that turn into wonderful Chilean wine, and copper mines, and the songs of Victor Jara and Inti Limani floating in the air. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. And Neruda obviously captured what an extraordinary place it was. Now Henry Kissinger once described Chile as, quote, a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. What did he mean? He meant that, of course, Chile was a country dangerous to nothing. It was a weapon pointed at nowhere. It had no strategic importance to the United States. But I'm here to tell you tonight that that was before Allende's election on September 4th, 1970. He uttered those words in 1969 in a conversation with Chile's foreign minister, who was trying to get him to pay more attention to the Southern Cone. And his response was, well, your country is a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica, really not so much worth my time. When it became apparent to Dr. Kissinger in the summer of 1970, given the polling in Chile, that Allende might actually win in a three-way race, he ordered the intelligence community, State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the CIA's Western Hemisphere Desk, the Defense Intelligence Agency, to all do an assessment. What would be the impact of Allende's election on the United States? This was a threat assessment, the type of thing that all the agencies were doing about Iraq over the last 2 years or so. And the intelligence community did a full-fledged national security study memorandum. And they came back with the following conclusion. One, Allende's election would not change the balance of military power, the balance of power in the world. Chile under Allende would pose no strategic threat to U.S. interests. The only impact of Allende's election would be a psychological impact on other countries in Latin America, which might want to follow Chile's lead and move peacefully through the democratic process to elect reformers and political figures who would institute through the democratic process substantive change that would affect U.S. economic interests, obviously, and U.S. Diplomatic interests. That was the assessment of the intelligence community. That is not what, however, Henry Kissinger told Richard Nixon. First, under Nixon's orders of September 15th, the United States tried to foment a coup covertly. A very small group of CIA officials trying to find a Chilean military clique that would move against Allende. That effort, that operation, led to the assassination of the Chilean commander-in-chief, General René Schneider, on October 22nd, 1970. Schneider was the equivalent of the head of our Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was a constitutionalist. He opposed a coup. None of the military under him would move without his orders. And so the CIA and the 3 or 4 Chilean generals they were working with came up with this 17-point plan, which I've actually copied and put in the book, that would start with General Schneider's kidnapping. He would be kidnapped. He'd be secretly flown to Argentina. A coup plotter would replace him as commander-in-chief. The military would declare that Allende's supporters had been responsible for this kidnapping. They would declare martial law, sweep through all of the shanty towns where Allende's supporters lived, arrest people, kind of decapitate the opposition, annul the elections, and then the plan kind of stopped there. There was no call for a return to democracy. There was no scheduling of new elections, etc. That plan is in the book. And at the bottom of that plan, by the way, is the request to the CIA for $50,000 to pay the group that was going to undertake this kidnapping. Instead of kidnapping Schneider, he was shot and killed. The CIA headquarters in Langley sent a cable, which I've also reproduced in the book, the next day, basically commending the station in Santiago for an excellent job. That's a quote, an excellent job in bringing Chileans to the point where a military solution is possible for them. Of course, anybody who observed Chile, anybody who knew anything about Chile's strong tradition of democracy and the lack of any political violence in recent memory in that country would understand that a shooting of this kind would rally the Chilean people around their leaders. This was an act of terrorism in Chile that was tantamount to an act of terrorism here in Washington. Really, it was the equivalent for Chileans at that point of the Kennedy assassination here for us. It was a shock to the system. And of course, the Chilean Congress 2 days later ratified Allende overwhelmingly, and he became president on November 3rd. Kissinger, 48 hours later, November 5th, brings a rather comprehensive set of briefing papers, these are them, to Richard Nixon. And he says to Nixon, tomorrow you're going to hold a National Security Council meeting, and it is absolutely imperative that you lay down the law to everybody in the national security bureaucracy, in the State Department, the Defense Department, the CIA, that you want Allende opposed as strongly as possible. If you don't do this, Kissinger argued, there will be a drift towards a modus vivendi with the Allende government, because the State Department believes that there's nothing we can do except live with Allende and hope that he becomes unpopular and is voted out in 1976. I oppose that, Kissinger wrote. He wrote to Richard Nixon, this is rather extraordinary. He wrote to Richard Nixon, Allende will seek to, quote, be internationally respectable, move cautiously and pragmatically, avoid immediate confrontation with us, move slowly in formalizing relations with Cuba and other socialist countries. These are all the things that he said Allende would do. It doesn't seem so outrageous, does it? But for Kissinger, this was Allende's game plan. This was a way for him to somehow lull the United States into thinking that they could get along with him. And for Kissinger, he laid out a series of issues that was a threat to the United States. In fact, he said to Nixon, the main problem with Allende is that he is going to set an example, the example of a successfully elected Marxist government in Chile would have an impact on and even precedent value for other parts of the world, especially Italy, especially countries in Western Europe. And the initiative spread of similar phenomena elsewhere would in turn have a significant effect on the world balance and our own position in it. And this is Kissinger now goading Richard Nixon. It's amazing to listen to the way they discussed these issues together. The election of Allende, Kissinger says to Richard Nixon, poses one of the most serious challenges ever faced in this hemisphere, and your decision as to what to do may be the most historic and difficult foreign policy decision you will have to make this year. And he goes on to argue all the reasons why Richard Nixon must lay down the law, and that is what Nixon did. I'm going to pass around the meeting the next day of Nixon and his National Security Council aides, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense. I just want you to be able to see what I've been able to see, which is the way that our highest U.S. officials discussed together in a conference room the future of another country. Regime change. That is really what it was. This was an explicit discussion about regime change in Chile. You have the Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird, saying, we have to hurt Allende and bring him down. And you have the Secretary of State saying, yes, I agree with that. We have to hurt him and bring him down, but we have to do it in a way that the rest of the world doesn't see what we're doing. Because obviously Allende's legitimate leader of Chile. He's democratically elected. We've repeatedly stated that we respect the international sovereignty of other countries and the democratic will of other citizenries. So we can't openly do this. We have to have a hostile approach, but disguise it finesse it as essentially a cool and distant approach rather than of U.S. aggression. Let me just send this around to you. It's one of the most extraordinary documents that was declassified in the last several years. Let me talk about the documents. As I just inferred, the value of these documents is extraordinary. You and I can be a fly on the wall as the highest U.S. officials discussed and deliberated strategies for U.S. foreign policy, in this case for bringing down another government, for determining the future of another country. We can be in the room when decisions are discussed, when objections are raised, when orders are given. And these documents really let you understand the mindset of our highest leaders. And the president appears in many of these documents. Kissinger appears in many of these documents. His aides present him with counter-arguments in many of these documents. You start to understand the way foreign policy makers think about other countries, the way they have a sense of their own power and the implementation of that power in other countries. And you certainly get a sense, a very detailed sense, of the actions taken. I just want to describe to you very briefly how we got these documents and how I was able to use a whole new set of declassified records to try and reapproach the history of U.S. relations with Chile. As many of you may remember, it's going to be 5 years. This in just a few weeks, in October 18th, I believe, that Augusto Pinochet was arrested in London. This was a stunning event. It shocked the world. it delighted many, many people who had been waiting a long, long time for this to happen and never believed it would, frankly. There was a small group, particularly of Spanish lawyers, one of them a former Spanish aide to Salvador Allende, who had spent 25 years after the coup trying to work on human rights in Chile, trying to adjust and rewrite the laws in Spain to make Spanish law applicable to Pinochet's crimes, and had eventually succeeded in doing this. So Spain, as you may recall, had petitioned London for Pinochet's extradition. He was vacationing in London. He had hurt his back, decided to have back surgery, and was laid up in a private clinic, the London clinic, when Spain, through Interpol, served an arrest warrant on him. This created a huge outcry around the world, an effort around the world to present the evidence of Pinochet's crimes. In the United States, where Pinochet's secret police had committed an egregious act of international terrorism, the September 1976 car bombing of Orlando Letelier's car and killing him, Pinochet's leading critic in the United States, former Chilean ambassador here, and his American colleague, Ronnie Carpin Moffett, on September 21st, 1976, right down there in Sheridan Circle. I'm sure many of you have seen the small monument that is there. But Pinochet, in other words, had committed a crime here, and there was a pressure here on the Clinton administration. If Spain was going to ask for Pinochet's extradition, why didn't the United States ask for Pinochet's extradition on the grounds of prosecuting this act of international terrorism? And the families of Pinochet's American victims, the families of Ronnie Carpin Moffett, the families of Orlando Letelier, those that were living here, and as well as Isabel, his widow, who was living in Chile at the time, pressed very hard for that case to be reopened. Joyce Horman, the widow of Charles Horman, the American killed after the coup, also lent her voice very loudly to pressuring the Clinton administration to help with the prosecution of Pinochet in Spain. For a variety of reasons, the Clinton administration did not want to add to the concept of universal jurisdiction. There's a fear in this country that American officials will someday come under the globalization of justice, and that the Pinochet precedent is not particularly good for officials like Henry Kissinger or perhaps others. And so the United States is not very fond of supporting that concept. And so the administration decided not to directly help the Spanish with evidence. But we, in my office and many others, worked with the administration kind of from the outside through political pressure from Congress, through newspaper articles, media coverage, and from the inside through the context that we had with very, very strong, courageous officials inside the Clinton administration to say, look, if you don't do something here, if you don't make some kind of gesture in this case, you're simply going to be protecting one of the vilest dictators in the recent history of South America, of Latin America. Why don't you just declassify all of the holdings on the Pinochet era? Why don't you just declassify the CIA reports on Pinochet's atrocities, the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency reports on Pinochet's terrorism inside Chile, outside Chile, etc. And eventually the administration decided to do a major declassification project, not just on the 17 years of the Pinochet dictatorship, but actually even back to U.S. holdings on the Allende period. This was an idea of some conservative in the State Department who said, well, if we declassify documents on Pinochet, we have to declassify documents on Allende because he was a socialist and he did bad things, and we don't want to seem imbalanced against Pinochet. We need to declassify documents on Allende also. Well, I could only stand back and applaud this decision, because in so doing, this particular individual opened the door to forcing the CIA to declassify documents on its involvement in political violence and terrorism in Chile. In other words, all the covert operations that took place between 1970 and 1973 to undermine the Allende government. 24,000 documents were declassified over a 2-year period. 24,000 secret documents that we hadn't seen before. And they told an extraordinary story of U.S. policy starting in 1970 before Allende's election, and ending in 1990 with Pinochet being voted out of office in a plebiscite and actually turning over power to civilians, at least partially turning over power to a civilian government. And the documents, you know, there were quite a few of them, 24,000. And if you put them in order and if you divided them up day by day, you almost had coverage of almost every day of that 20-year period, and certainly the most critical days of that 20-year period. And it allowed us to go back and revisit this history. It allowed me to take a stab at rewriting this history, both the history of U.S. efforts to undermine Salvador Allende, undermine democracy in Chile, and the history of U.S. efforts to bolster Augusto Pinochet, particularly in the first 3 years after his coup. We've just passed the 30th anniversary of the coup in Chile. A lot of focus was on that 3-year period, 70 to 73, and what the United States did. I'll leave it to you to examine the first 2 chapters of the book and the 25 or 30 documents that go with the first 2 chapters of the book to have a sense of what new we've been able to learn. I wanted to spend just a minute with you, though, talking about the post-coup period, which we're in right now. What was going on 30 years ago today, on September 16th? And I can tell you from the declassified documents what was going on. Secret back-channel efforts to send messages to Augusto Pinochet that the United States government would avidly support him. A whole series of meetings in Washington, cable traffic down to Santiago, secret intermediaries going to Augusto Pinochet, starting on the 13th of September, 48 hours after the coup, and going all the way through in the weeks to come. Let me just share with you the first cable that went down to Santiago, to the embassy, giving them instructions on what to tell Augusto Pinochet. We had Henry Kissinger, who was up on Capitol Hill at this very same time. Fortuitously, coincidentally, he was being confirmed as Secretary of State the day after the coup, and his confirmation hearings were being held. And of course, he was peppered with questions about the U.S. role in the coup and what the U.S. policy was towards the new military junta. And he said to them, we are neutral towards this change of government. He said, we didn't want to make the mistake that we made in 1964 when we ran out and embraced the military regime that took power in Brazil at that time. We learned our lesson then. We're remaining neutral now. At the very time he was saying that to the senators, top secret cables were being sent to the U.S. Embassy in Santiago, Chile, to pass a message to Augusto Pinochet. And this cable is titled, U.S. Government Attitude Toward Junta. The U.S. government wishes to make clear its desire to cooperate with the military junta and to assist in any appropriate way. We agree that it is best initially to avoid too much public identification between us. And so we are pleased to maintain unofficial contacts. Only 3 or 4 days later, a similar cable went down. We want the government of Chile to know of our strongest desire to cooperate closely and establish firm basis for cordial and most constructive relationship. The documents allow you to see behind the scenes what was going on. And these cables are being sent at almost the identical, these cables are going down to Chile at the identical time that CIA intelligence reports are coming up from Chile on massive bloodshed, massive bloodletting by the Chilean military. The CIA, even though engaged in specific covert operations, one wing of the station there routinely reported on various aspects of repression, as did the Defense Intelligence Agency in Santiago. So you have literally dozens and dozens of reports on repression, starting from the day following the coup and going all the way up through to the late 1980s. The bloodshed was so widespread in the days following the coup that that the CIA sources really couldn't even accurately count how many people had been killed by the military. 1 week after the coup, a cable came up saying that 4,000 civilians had been killed in the aftermath of the coup. Another cable came up a few days later saying that a source had said from anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 civilian casualties had taken place because of the coup and after the coup. A few weeks later, the CIA intercepted a secret report that had been written by the Chilean military for the junta to report on the exact figures of how many people were killed in the 3 weeks after the coup, how many people had been arrested, how many people had been detained, where they were being detained, etc. And in the 3 weeks following the coup, according to this intelligence report, about 12 to 1,300 civilians had been killed. 350 to 400 of them summarily executed. 13,700 have been rounded up, taken to the National Stadium in Chile, and there several hundred were actually executed, among them 2 American citizens, Charles Horman and Frank Tarugi. We can chart our policymakers' response to this information. We know when Kissinger received reports of these atrocities. One of the most extraordinary documents was a declassified transcript of a Kissinger State Department staff meeting on October 1st, when his Assistant Secretary for Latin America comes in right from Capitol Hill, and he says, the senators have been saying to me, what about these massacres? What about all these deaths? And the Assistant Secretary says to Kissinger, can it be true? What should I tell? What should I tell the senators? And Kissinger says, point blank to his staff, I want us to understand our policy. However bad the behavior of this new military government, it is better for us and for our interests than Allende was. And that was the policy that was laid down to U.S. officials. Kissinger really had a disdain for the issue of human rights. He believed that human rights got in the way of diplomacy and power politics. He was a man who believed in realpolitik. At one point, when the U.S. ambassador sent up a cable that talked about human rights atrocities in Chile, he scrawled on it, cut out the political science lectures. The declassified transcripts of his meetings are rather extraordinary. They reveal attitudes that are even hard for someone as jaded as myself, who has studied Dr. Kissinger's policies in Chile to believe. As the repression got worse in Chile over the first couple of years, Kissinger came under increased pressure from beneath, from his own staff, to bring up the issue, to press the issue of human rights with the Chilean regime. He really didn't want to do this, and he seemed to be more critical of the people in his own State Department raising the issue than of the Chileans themselves. And I'll just give you an example. This is a memorandum of conversation between Kissinger and Pinochet's foreign minister in September of 1975, Foreign Minister Patricio Carvajal. And the foreign minister comes into this meeting, and in all these meetings there would be a note taker, would take shorthand, and then the shorthand would be transcribed, and you'd actually have a full transcript of everything that was said, which fortunately exists today. And those of you who worked on human rights in the mid-1970s in Chile will appreciate this. The foreign minister comes into this meeting, and the first thing he says to Kissinger is, I want to thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk to you. And Kissinger says to him, well, I read the briefing paper for this meeting, and it was nothing but human rights. The State Department is made up of people who have a vocation for the ministry. Because there are not enough churches for them, they went into the Department of State. And that was the attitude that he professed. We have another transcript, which is equally extraordinary, and that is a transcript of Henry Kissinger's private discussions with Augusto Pinochet in Chile in June of 1976. Pinochet's staff had pressed him to say something about human rights, to go to the OAS conference in Chile and make a speech about human rights. And they touted this to the U.S. Congress and to the American public as a change of U.S. policy, that the United States was going to pressure the Chilean government on human rights. And in his memoirs, the third volume of his memoirs, Kissinger writes about this meeting with Pinochet. And he says, I went in there and I talked to General Pinochet about democracy and human rights, and I told him he had to clean up his act or U.S. aid was going to get cut off. I pressed him on this issue. Pinochet complained. Kissinger writes that his friends, the United States, was treating him badly, and I returned to my theme of democracy and human rights. That is what Kissinger wrote in his memoir. We got the declassified transcript of this actual meeting, which is amazing that it survived and that we now have it to compare to what Dr. Kissinger writes in his memoirs. And what he does in this meeting is he goes in and talks to Pinochet and basically says, look, this is what I'm going to say and this is why I have to say it. And I want you to understand this. And this is actually what he says. He reviews with Pinochet what he is going to say in the speech. He's about to give the speech 2 weeks later. And he says, I will call attention to human rights. I can do no less without producing a reaction in the United States which might lead to legislative restrictions on aid, military and economic aid with you. The speech is not aimed at Chile, he says to Pinochet. I wanted to tell you about this. My evaluation is that you are a victim of all left-wing groups around the world, and that your greatest sin was that you overthrew a government which was going communist. Just a few minutes later in the meeting, he is talking to Pinochet, and Pinochet is complaining, as Kissinger wrote in his memoirs, that the United States is treating him badly, the United States treats its friends badly. And Kissinger writes in his memoirs, as I just said, that I return to my theme of human rights and democracy. But in fact, when you read the transcript, you see that he did not return to this theme. Pinochet complains, you have a punitive system for your friends. And Kissinger responds, there is merit in what you say. It is a curious time in the United States. It is unfortunate. We have been through Vietnam and Watergate. We have to wait until the elections, the 1976 election between Ford and Carter. We welcomed the overthrow of the communist-inclined government here. We are not out to weaken your position. And at the very end of the meeting, Kissinger says, we want to help, not undermine you. You did a great service to the West in overthrowing Allende. This is the type of history that the documents gives us. And it enables us to return to the issues of the past, to re-examine them, to understand how they're relevant to today. Many of the issues that were debated around Chile, the issue of U.S. intervention, the issue of regime change, the issue of preemptive strike, the issue of honesty and dishonesty in government, the issue of covert operations and controls over them, the issues of what was being done in the name of the American people around the world, in their name but without their knowledge. All those issues came to play in Chile. When you study Chile, there's an echo, obviously, in the present that's worth considering. But on its own, it is worth evaluating as a case study of morality and immorality in the exercise of U.S. foreign policy. It continues to plague U.S. foreign policymakers. Right on the eve of the war in Iraq, a questioner stood up and asked Secretary of State Colin Powell how the United States could argue on moral grounds that we should go in and overthrow Saddam Hussein, given what we had done in Chile, overthrowing Allende and supporting Pinochet. And Powell's response was, in Chile in the 1970s, it is not a part of our country's history that we are proud of. I'll stop there. I will take any questions that you have, and thank you again for coming.
have people line up here and ask you questions through the microphone here? Would that be okay? Can
That-
you announce that there?
That's fine. I don't know if that mic is working too loud. I'm willing. Anybody can line up there, but if people want to shout out their questions so everybody can hear, you can do that too.
Do you think Kissinger is indictable for lying off it and some others?
You need people to be at the microphone?
If you repeat the question.
Wait, you can repeat it.
They would like people to go to the microphone and ask the questions. In this first case, I will repeat the question, which was, do I think that Kissinger is indictable for Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat? You know, I think the answer to that is no. There's a fascinating story of what the U.S. government, Kissinger's office, and the CIA knew about Chilean plans to assassinate critics abroad prior to the Letelier-Moffat assassination. And it's a story that is told in the book, all the documents telling what prior knowledge the U.S. government had about this consortium of secret police agencies in the Southern Cone called Operation Condor. That was the mechanism under which terrorists came to Washington and planted this bomb. Is rather amazing. For more than 25 years, we only had one declassified document on Operation Condor and the Letelier assassination, and it was an FBI report dated a week after the assassination. And it appeared to be an intelligence report. It was an FBI intelligence report based on intelligence gained from Argentina. And it said that it is likely that the assassination in Washington was a Phase 3 operation of Operation Condor. And for 25 years, we thought, given this document, that the U.S. government officials had learned a week after the fact about Operation Condor. And then when all the documents were declassified several years ago, we found out that, in fact, the CIA had known 5 months before the Letelier-Moffat assassination about Condor and its assassination plans. Excuse me, not the specific Letelier mission, but the fact that these governments and the secret services, secret police agencies of these governments had met together and had designed a plan to coordinate surveillance on their critics around the world and to send special teams out to kill specific critics in Europe, in Latin America, and in the United States. In the book, I have the report that was given to Kissinger on August 3rd, 1976, about this intelligence and what to do about it. And it turns out that this was a case, in some ways it resonates so forcefully with our own September 11th, 2001. This is a case where there was an abundance of intelligence that could have been put together in one place and some response issued that would have detected and deterred this mission. And for a variety of reasons, that was not done. The most ironic, extraordinary document is a document dated September 20th, 1976, in the late afternoon, from the Assistant Secretary for Latin America saying, let's close down all efforts to say to the Condor countries that we oppose what they're doing because there doesn't seem to be any active assassination plans afoot. 18 hours later, the bomb went off at Sheridan Circle in Washington. We have a line of people. I'll keep my answers shorter.
What role did Ambassador Nathaniel Davis, who was in Santiago at the time, play in all of this?
Nathaniel Davis was our ambassador starting in 1972 in Chile. He left in the fall of '73 after the coup. He was there in the final months of Allende and was there in the initial weeks of the Pinochet regime. He played an interesting role. He opposed certain plans that the CIA had to directly sponsor protests and agitation and strikes in the street. He sided with another State Department official back here in Washington in suggesting that the CIA not be so aggressive because for him it wasn't clear that the Chilean military was actually ready to foment a coup. And he was concerned that the United States would be directly implemented in a failed coup or et cetera, and he just didn't feel that was, given that the CIA had already participated in a failed coup 3 years earlier in the fall of 1970. He actually opposed that. He, however, was very aggressive in trying to promote the junta from the moment that it took office. He sent back a series of cables, some of which are reproduced in the book, suggesting aid to the junta. He personally came up with the idea of the CIA secretly sponsoring a tour around the world of members of the Chilean Christian Democratic Party to present a justification for the coup to Europe and the rest of Latin America. And diplomatically and politically and economically, he pressed very quickly for aid to be given to Pinochet. There is a document in the book where of a conversation he has with Pinochet as he's getting ready to leave Santiago and return to Washington, which is quite interesting, actually.
What has been the consequence of the doctrine of universal jurisdiction issued by the Spanish judge? First of all, what happened to Pinochet? Was he ever tried and, adjudicated? And has it ever been a precedent? Has it ever happened again?
It is a precedent, and I think it has had a very significant impact. Specifically to Pinochet, Pinochet spent a year under house arrest in London, more than a year. The British courts ruled repeatedly that legally he should be extradited to Spain to stand trial. A behind-the-scenes deal was cut between the British government and the Chilean government, which didn't want Pinochet sent to Spain. They preferred that nothing happened to him, but since this had been a very embarrassing episode, they argued that they would prosecute him in Chile, and that would be the best thing for Chilean nationalism and for the Chilean legal system if he was prosecuted there. So he was sent back to Chile. At that point, I think all observers of his case thought that this was over, but in fact, a very aggressive and courageous judge, Judge Guzman, in Santiago, pressed forward with charges against Pinochet. He was actually indicted there. He was stripped of his political immunity, and at one point he came about this close to having his mugshot taken and being fingerprinted. Eventually, after a whole round of court votes, all the way up to the Supreme Court, the court ruled that for the same given reason that he had been allowed to leave London, that he could not be tried in Chile, and that was mental incapacity, mental dementia. At that point, at that ruling, he was about 85 or 86 years old. He immediately, after this ruling, wrote a letter, which was quite coherent for somebody who was mentally demented, announcing that he was going to withdraw from public life and that he hoped Chileans would understand the great effort he had made on their behalf during his time in government. But the impact of that case certainly has led other countries to press for similar types of cases around the world. I think it has empowered the International Court of Justice, where Milosevic is being tried right now. There's a case that's going to be taking place right here in the United States, in Florida, starting on Monday, with a Chilean family whose brother was killed in what was called the Caravan of Death, which I described in the book, which was a kind of a death squad that Pinochet sent out after the coup to fly into other provinces of the country and take people who had been put in prison, Allende's civic leaders, the sheriffs, the mayors, the police chiefs, etc. They had all been imprisoned after the coup, but he sent in a helicopter squad, and everywhere the helicopter landed, at night, these political prisoners would be taken out of the prison and marched to a ravine and shot, and a number of them had been disappeared. And one of them was the brother of Zita Caballo, who lives in San Francisco. And one of the members of this squad that was on this helicopter came to the United States. It was part of the Letelier mission to kill Orlando Letelier. He eventually turned himself in to U.S. authorities, served, I don't know, something on the order of 11 months in jail. He'd cut a plea bargain with the Justice Department, which seems to have included not sending him back to Chile. And they are bringing a lawsuit against him actually in Florida, where he lives now, to try and prosecute him. So the concept of potential universal jurisdiction may have come to the United States with this case. We'll have to see how it turns out. But I think there's no doubt that in terms of the concept of the globalization of justice, the Pinochet precedent has certainly spurred on other countries to try this tactic as often as they can, and I think we'll be seeing more of those types of prosecutions. Certainly dictators, former dictators like Pinochet, are much more hesitant to leave their home bases, their sanctuaries of power, and travel abroad at this point.
Thank you for your huge educational efforts. Just a point about, there was a docu-movie released last year about Dr. Kissinger, which covers Chile. I'm not sure, have you seen it?
The Trials of Henry Kissinger, is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah.
It's a documentary. Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that?
Yeah, I'm in that movie and I've seen it.
Oh, right. Second minor point is, the name Pinochet sounds French. Is that right? Is that his background?
Is it French? Yeah. And what is the background of? Does anybody know?
He has a grandmother from.
He has his grandmother is from Brittany. Is that? I see. Well, that's the answer to that question. His grandmother's from Brittany.
Hi. In last Friday's Wall Street Journal, a writer argued that Pinochet really saved Chile from becoming a totalitarian state, and that French Secret Service were training thousands of people from around the world, revolutionaries, presumably to help it become a totalitarian state. Apart from the fact that the Wall Street Journal is a ultra-conservative newspaper, and that the writer doesn't express any concern for the thousands that were killed under Pinochet, is there any validity to the claim that this was going to turn into another, I don't know, China, I guess, or that's his point?
U.S. policymakers and conservative observers of politics, such as the person who wrote that article, always made assumptions about socialists, Marxists, etc. Allende was a Marxist, but he was never a Marxist-Leninist. He was never a Stalinist. He had a long, very venerable and prestigious history in Chilean politics. He'd run for president 3 times before he actually won in 1970. He came very close to winning in 1958, which would have totally changed the history of Latin America if he had been elected at that point and become the first freely elected Marxist leader then, rather than Fidel Castro becoming the model of revolution in Latin America a year later. And that was something that astute CIA analysts also understood, that Chile represented a very different model from Fidel Castro, almost the antithesis of Castro's model. Kissinger himself laid it out, how Allende was going to behave. He considered it a ruse, but it wasn't Allende who closed down the free press. It wasn't Allende who invaded the universities. It wasn't Allende who closed down Congress and banned political parties. And it wasn't Allende who created a secret police force and to wield repression, to implement a vast repressive policy. It was Pinochet. And all the people that argued, as the writer in the Wall Street Journal did, never said absolutely anything about that. There was nothing that, I think, certainly Allende was pressing for substantive change in Chile more than he had the popular support to implement. He also had on his left, outside of his coalition, leftist forces who were pro-Cuba. Some of them had been to Cuba. Some of them were working with Cubans, who wanted to press along his acceleration, the momentum of change in Chile. And those forces were just as problematic for Allende, as any of his aides will tell you, as the right-wing forces. He didn't control them. It was very difficult to suppress them, although anybody who was in Chile at the time knows that many of their protests and land seizures were suppressed, were reversed, etc. But they created extreme problems for him as well. Was there any possibility that Allende would have created a totalitarian system? I don't think the Chilean system, from what I know of it, would have actually permitted that. At no point would he ever have been able to take over the military, which at all points, if it had remained constitutional, could have assured the constitutional transactions of the future of Chile. There wasn't any force that would juxtapose or, counter the force of the military. So when you look at the calculations that Kissinger and Nixon made, I don't think any of them were based in the actual facts of the Chilean past or the Chilean future. The argument, and I'll just return to it, that Kissinger and Nixon made was that their efforts in Chile were to preserve democracy there. But the extraordinary fact is that once all of those bastions of democracy that they had said they were supporting were essentially repressed by Pinochet, there was not a single effort to support them. I have in the book a very interesting story of the debate inside the U.S. government of continuing to covertly support the Christian Democratic Party in the year following the coup. And there was a series of arguments that were made. This Ambassador Davis and then his successor, Ambassador Popper, wanted to support the Christian Democrats because they hoped that support for them would lead them to support the junta. The CIA, ironically, this was most extraordinary, the CIA wanted to support the Christian Democrats in the aftermath of the coup because they felt that there would eventually be a return to the democratic process in Chile, and they wanted the Christian Democrats to be the strongest, to be stronger than the leftist parties, which were being repressed at that point, but might reemerge. And U.S. officials around Kissinger, a few of them, wanted to support the Christian Democrats because they realized how hypocritical it would be if they suddenly cut off aid to the one main symbol of democracy in Chile. But Kissinger and his aides decided that they did not want to offend Pinochet by continuing to support a political party that he had banned. And so they authorized one minuscule final payment of $50,000 to the Christian Democratic Party, and aid was cut off. I have one of the dissent memos reprinted in the book, which is well worth reading, where a mid-level State Department official says, I would like to see a time when the United States was on the right side of history in Latin America and supporting a symbol of democracy in Chile against a government, as he wrote, that can be documented to be fascistic, tyrannical, militaristic, and murderous is something we should do. This is not Peter Kornbluh speaking. This is one of Kissinger's aides in the State Department writing to oppose the decision to cut off covert support for the Christian Democratic Party.
Sir, thank you for what you wrote and what you said tonight. Let me say briefly that, if anything, American foreign policy in Latin America has not only been right, has been extremely right, dangerously right. In fact, just as Vice President Ford, when he became president, had the great courage to pardon Richard Nixon, I think he sinned for a serious omission of not awarding Kissinger the John Foster Dulles Medal for Patriotism and Patriotic Anti-Communism. Now, leaving black humor aside, about 20 years ago, there was a very touching movie that was made, I believe, in Hollywood called Missing, about that American journalist, I believe, that was caught and executed, and the efforts of his widow to find out the action. That movie, without perhaps all the backing of all these declassified documents, I think already laid out very clearly what was the nature of the Pinochet government and sort of served as a serious indictment against the U.S. foreign policy. Did you think that he played such a role?
The movie Missing was a pivotal event as a Hollywood product and as a movie that really, I think, brought Chile and the whole issue of U.S. foreign policy in Chile to public attention in a huge way. A year ago, my son and I went to a major event celebrating the 20th anniversary of the movie in New York City. The director, Konstantin Costa-Gavras, was there. Joyce Horman was there, the real widow of Charles Horman, and Sissy Spacek, who played her in the movie, was also there. And it was a movie that I suggest everybody see. Anybody who, I'm sure most everybody's seen. How many people have seen Missing? How many people haven't seen Missing? Very few of you haven't seen the movie, but it certainly is a movie worth seeing. And I think it had a huge impact on us as showing the power of a forceful Hollywood movie with great reach.
Peter, as you're well aware, soon after the coup, Congressman Don Fraser, chair of the subcommittee, House International Relations Committee, had a series of hearings on Chile, co-chaired with Danny Fasel. Senator Kennedy was active on the Senate side. Of course, Tom Harkin, as a junior House member, made a trip to Chile. To what extent did these things make any difference, or were they simply a nuisance to the Kissinger, or were they helpful to the, such as the lower level, mid-level official you mentioned earlier? Did they have some impact on working? What do you think was the difference or impact?
Anybody interested in human rights needs to study the case of Chile. The human rights movement, as we know it today, grew up around the Chilean issue. The laws that were passed in the offices that were just mentioned, also with Senator Kennedy in the Senate and in the House, Bonkers and Fasel and Harkin and George Miller and Toby Moffett, really were, you can call them the Pinochet-Kissinger laws, because they were a response from Congress to Kissinger's desire to aid Pinochet despite his egregious human rights violations. And what you can see in the documents is how this debate and how growing congressional pressure infiltrated the State Department and caused Henry Kissinger great upset. We have the declassified transcripts of many of his meetings, which were dominated by him yelling at his aides not to let Ted Kennedy and Congressman Bonkers get away with passing legislation that would restrict Kissinger's ability to give military support and economic support to Pinochet and to other military dictators. And this comes to a head in meetings in late 1974 and mid-1975. And Kissinger basically advances three arguments that are very important with his aides. We shouldn't let this happen because Pinochet is no worse than Allende was, no worse than any other government down there. He kind of peppers his aides with this question. You know, is it worse than any other Latin American countries? And his deputy has to tell him yes. And then his second argument is basically that if we don't give this aid to Pinochet, he's going to fall. He's going to collapse. And this is, I think, for me, the most extraordinary argument. You know, Kissinger really stepped up and said, I don't want this government to collapse. And I don't want to cut off aid to it, and I don't want there to be a resurgence of the political forces that it overthrew. And he makes this argument again and again and again. And finally, his final argument was that, of course, if the Congress got away with restricting aid to Pinochet, it would get away with restricting aid to all sorts of other countries. What's next, he said to his aides? Taiwan, South Korea? You know, if we give them an inch, they'll take a mile, that kind of argument. And finally, and I just have to share this with you. He says, this is insane. He says this congressional efforts to restrict my ability to give aid to Pinochet is insane. And his deputy, his assistant secretary for Latin America, says, it is insane, but Mr. Secretary, it does reflect an extraordinarily strong feeling amongst the Congress, as you well know. You can go to the mat on it now if you want to, and I predict you will have a hell of a fight on your hands. There are a lot of Democrats on the Hill this coming session who want to go to the mat on the issue of human rights and want to make a fight about it. It is very hard to make a national, interest argument on Chile. The human rights issue has caught the imagination up on the Hill, as you well know, Mr. Secretary, and amongst the American people. My diagnosis is the reason they've stuck it to the department, in this case, is that they don't think we are sincere on human rights. And that was William Rogers, Assistant Secretary for Latin America, speaking to Kissinger in a meeting in late 1974. I think it gives you a sense from the inside of the impact that the work that a number of people, even in this room, including yourself, were doing at the time, and how it was bringing pressure on Henry Kissinger and his policies towards Chile. Yes, my dear.
I want to say, as a Chilean, looking back, the Chilean government of Allende was always caught in the struggle, in the internal struggle, and beside that, with the foreign policy of the United States. Allende, the first thing that he did in his government was to nationalize the copper mine. Our raw material, our export, as he used to say, the budget of the Chilean people, the salary of our workers. Then he touched a very sensitive point, for the American interests. Besides that, the internal problem, was within the parties. Always the Christian democracy was trying to make a parallel between the leftist coalition with the Cuban Revolution. And Allende used to say always, this is a revolution, meaning that it's going to be a big change, but in liberty. And he really committed himself when was demanded by our Congress that never would be, violated our Constitution. The result of all this sad, situation, the involvement of the CIA, the American foreign policy and so, is that up to now, we have not recovered our democracy. We don't have a full democracy in Chile because still we are ruled by the Constitution of Pinochet, that he designated some senators. And we are struggling for that. We don't have majority. When I say we don't have, the elected, it doesn't matter right or left, but Pinochet Constitution is the one that is ruling Chile up to now. And that is the reason that Mr. Pinochet, that was declared insane, he socialized. I met him in a cafe in Santiago, Chile, 1 month ago. Very happy, the insane. You see? I want to say only that. I become emotional with it.
Well, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a question, but it was a very important comment. Go ahead.
I'm really humbled to follow such eloquence with two fairly mundane questions. But the first one, in the trials of Henry Kissinger, he speaks, the documentarian speaks about the case of Renee Schneider's family against Kissinger on the morning of September 11th, 2001, getting completely, obviously overturned by all that else went on that day. What is the current status of that case? And then my second question is just, listening to you tonight and these documents, I walk away here feeling such pessimism, such sadness about how little we've learned from this, particularly in the current circumstances that we face with our senior officials. Do you have any more optimism and hope about this than I am left with tonight?
Not really.
Darn.
The case of Renee Schneider is one that was investigated by the Senate committee in 1975. There were a number of documents, it turns out, that were not shown to that committee, and I've been able to read them and use them in revisiting that case again. I actually gave the first chapter of the book several years ago to 60 Minutes, and they found out that the family of Renee Schneider was going to sue Henry Kissinger and Richard Helms, the CIA director, for wrongful death in a U.S. court. This was, again, in the aftermath of the impact of Pinochet's arrest and the possibility that a crime committed there in Chile could perhaps be prosecuted here, at least not a criminal case, but a civil case. And 60 Minutes did air on Sunday night, September 9th, 2001, a piece that all about the Schneider case and with the new documents and the whole issue of Kissinger's potential or alleged responsibility in this episode. The case was then filed in U.S. court the next day on September 10th, and on the morning of September 11th, the Washington Post ran a very long story. But of course, by the afternoon of September 11th, Dr. Kissinger was on television and actually talking about how the Senate investigation into alleged assassinations of foreign leaders in the mid-1970s had restricted the CIA from being able to assassinate people like Osama bin Laden. And that really was the villain here, that Congress had somehow undermined our ability to carry out executive action against Osama bin Laden. So he'd become, an advocate of assassination. Of course, he was mistaken. The Clinton administration had been trying for 3 years to assassinate Osama bin Laden. The CIA had carte blanche to get him whenever it could, and it just hadn't been able to. The opportunities that the agency had were too narrow, too small, involved too many civilian casualties, and they had not been able to carry out this mission. Certainly, I think Chile does resonate today. And I haven't dwelled as much as I could have on the misrepresentation of this policy. But honesty in government became a big issue in the aftermath of the Chilean case. U.S. officials had repeatedly testified to Congress that our policy in Chile was to have the type of relations with Allende that he wanted to have with us. And we have the declassified documents which shows that that is absolutely false. Dr. Kissinger testified before the Senate in September of 1974. He was asked about Chile, about the U.S. role in the coup, and he said it was not our policy to subvert or destabilize the Allende government. And we have the declassified documents now where meeting after meeting after meeting he pushes and authorizes and directs exactly that policy. And those documents are in the book for anybody to see. And so I think that is an issue again. Chile was a very different case than the types of cases we're confronting today. It was a democratically elected government that had never repressed anybody, that had never threatened the United States with violence, did not have weapons of mass destruction, was not a terrorist regime, etc. This was about covert intervention, not about overt intervention. But some of the same issues that have been debated over the last year were internally at least debated as this policy unfolded in Chile. And then certainly in the aftermath of the coup, Chile became the catalyst for the first national debate over the propriety of covert operations and the first national debate over institutionalizing human rights as a criteria of our foreign policy. We are now into a debate over humanitarian intervention. There was obviously a major issue about a major difference. Clearly, there is a major difference between overthrowing a tyrant and installing one. And so there are grave differences. But in the broad themes, Chile does offer a lot of lessons, and most of them don't seem to be being learned right at this moment.
Hi, Peter. My question follows on from that question and your comments. Somebody once said, I think, that what we learn from the close study of history is that we don't learn from history. And in fact, so much of what went wrong in a fundamental sense with the U.S. policy and manipulation in Chile has been hidden, except over time with you and others so courageously and skillfully drawing it forth, painfully drawing it forth, and a lot of it's still in the shadows, and now we have a government that's behaving in that fashion at least as with at least as much effect and malign intent as Nixon and Kissinger ever did. I mean, I was going to ask what your sense of hopefulness about that was, but you sort of answered that. Maybe the thing to ask is the slender kind of avenue toward a truthful understanding that's the only platform on which better and more honest policies can be fought for is to know as much of what went on as possible. and therefore National Security Archives and the case study of the Chilean papers gives us one example of that. How are you and the endeavor to have that kind of access, that kind of release of public documents, and therefore some glimmer of the truth, how is that faring under George W. Bush currently, an administration that is so steeped in secrecy and doing it behind closed doors? I mean, how do you see the future of the generic effort to get public revelation of the public's business?
A difficult and hard road. Under the justification of fighting terrorism, secrecy has been significantly expanded in our government circles in almost every realm. You'd be interested to know that there are documents that have been declassified and on the shelves of the National Archives for years that have now been reclassified, are under review, and are being censored, even though they've been sitting on the shelves for many years because of a changing criteria over what should be open to the public and what shouldn't be open to the public. And obviously, in the difficult situation that we're in, the arguments for further secrecy are being made, being institutionalized, and being implemented. It's going to be harder to get presidential papers in the future. It's going to be harder to use the Freedom of Information Act. I think that you'll still be able to get documents on foreign policy episodes going back to the 70s, but more recent issues are going to be very difficult. We will re-meet here in 30 years on the anniversary of the War of Iraq to study whatever declassified documents we are possibly able to get by that time, and I can guarantee you, even if we do that, we won't have all the documents 30 years from now because many of them will still be secret 30 years from now, I believe. There was the famous philosopher that once said, you know, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And that is particularly true when it comes to transparency in government. There's no doubt that the world has changed. There's no doubt that U.S. policies have to be different given what happened to us 2 years ago. But to use secrecy and expand secrecy under the guise of fighting terrorism is in the end going to be a formula for the types of activities that we've seen in the past that, as Colin Powell put it, weren't proud moments for our country. I'm going to stop. You've been so wonderful to sit here. I appreciate it. I'm going to sit here and sign a few books if anybody wants their book signed, but thank you so very much for coming.
The Pinochet File, a declassified dossier on atrocity and accountability, is published by the New Press on the web at newpress.com.